So this is a client spotlight, and today I am talking to the amazing Adele Stickland, who is an organizational psychologist. And Adele, if I could just hand over you to just explain a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Well, it's lovely to be here, Helen. I really thoroughly enjoyed working with you. I tend to help organisations improve well-being. And more importantly, that conversation has moved on, especially after the pandemic, to bigger issues like psychological safety and the job hopping millennials, and creating psychological contracts for them within the organisation so that they stay in the job. And overall, that gives a very collaborative team environment and team structure. So that's my focus.
Yeah, it's lovely and juicy and amazing, and I absolutely loved working with you. So when we started working together, where were you at in terms of what you needed and where you were?
I had a lot of expertise that wasn't really focused. So I knew an awful lot. I could problem solve for the client, but I hadn't hung my hat on a particular focus. So I think I was like a lot of academics. I was quite interested in the bigger picture, but couldn't really focus on the deep dive for what the client pain points were and what I could solve, what my specialism was. So I lacked basically clarity.
Yeah, so as you say, there's a vast amount of expertise and track record in terms of delivery as well. But it was that evolution of
Yes.
of self, but also a focus in terms of where to specifically focus your expertise so that you could be meeting the needs of your audience. And just to clarify, your audience are the corporate audience.
Yes.
Yeah. So leaders and employees within the corporate world for this particular area of your business.
I think the pandemic made a big difference to everybody. You could be a well-being expert and professional before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic, everyone was a well-being professional. So I had comments from clients: if I have to breathe in and breathe out one more time, I'm going to scream. It just became a saturated market, and you could see that. I was doing lots of delivery during the pandemic, but you could see that there were a lot of more people coming on board, and it was no longer relevant to just be talking about well-being and resilience, which to me is the proactive response to well-being. That was me positioning myself in, don't just look at the negative spiral of stress, look at how you can prevent stress, look at how you can be more resilient. And it needed to evolve again from that. So that was our focus working together, was what would that evolve into and how would that strategically work for clients, and listening to what the clients were saying to me and what the problems that they were hearing led me into a conversation with you that helped me to build the whole program and the structure of the keynote that I was talking about, which helped me to then have better conversations with clients, because I was razor sharp on what I knew were their problems because I'd heard it.
Yeah, so just sort of summarizing there, so that the pandemic necessitated taking a different angle based on your expertise, but looking at it from a different approach that meant that you were really meeting the real needs of the corporate clients rather than just a sort of blanket well-being approach, which a lot of people were using at that time. So as you say, we looked at the keynote first.
Yes.
And in our conversations around building that, this thread emerged, didn't it?
Yes.
And I remember you bringing this thread up. Are you able to share with us what that is?
Well, it's the generational mindset gap, and it was the way that things were coming up in terms of culture, and how, I'm going to call them the older generation. I don't want to be too specific because people often don't always associate with their generation, whether it's boomers or Gen X, and how they'd held on to this culture. And we had the younger generation that were coming into the workforce rapidly, and the culture not matching up. You know, the way things have always been done. This is how it's always been done. And when you talk to the legal profession, their work is always about training the younger generation in a way that's osmosis, i.e. they have to learn on the job. Well, that's not necessarily what millennials and the younger generation wants to learn. That's not the way that they want to learn. So unpicking those and coming up with myths that we were hearing over and over again in the workplace, like millennials are snowflakes, millennials don't work very hard, they'll run off as soon as the job gets too hard. This is what I was hearing from clients. They were saying this. So the problem was a perception. It was what the older generation or the senior management team was assuming was the problem, but they hadn't really dug deep into that actual problem. So what was happening, there was millennials were coming into the jobs, they were lost, they didn't have any agency, they didn't have any control over what they were doing, they don't know what their professional development path is, they don't know what their personal development path is. And this is all about the psychological contract. So making sure that those teams work together well and the gap isn't huge is the way to move forward, and to make sure that the culture changes and evolves in a way that the whole conversation for the whole workforce has evolved.
And that's such a good way of explaining it. And so what you then did was built a keynote, a signature talk around these myths, presenting them as myths to bust, as it were.
Yes.
And that formed the structure that we worked on together to create this keynote talk that addresses this very specific but very, very important problem that many people are seeing in the workplace, and looks at ways to solve it. Not completely solve it, because you can't do that in a keynote. But one thing that you did highlight there was it doesn't just end there, because the keynote, especially if you're a service-based business and you are serving corporate clients, that the keynote is in alignment with other offerings.
Yes.
Other programs, workshops, solutions that can unpack those fantastic subjects even further. So we did some work around that as well, didn't we?
Yes, absolutely. Because the whole, and that was breaking down my products and the way that my products work, because they felt very disparate. You know, there was something on stress, there was something on resilience, there was something on mental fitness, there was something on physical fitness, and how did this all come together? But you have a keynote where you look at the overview, which is your introduction into the client, into the organization, and it's raising awareness. Because in a keynote, you can't give masses of solutions. You can only inspire and hope that, you know, a couple of comments will have come out. People feel that they've raised their awareness of the problem, and they've also raised the awareness that this is something that can be solved. And we know, again, harping back just gently onto the pandemic, we were trying to do so many PowerPoint presentations, and this is the facts, and this is what you want to do. Well, you can't do that anymore. It has to be a facilitation. It has to be a conversation. It has to be more about what that person or what that listener is going to get from the keynote. So it's much more involved, it's much more inspirational, which incidentally in my work I know that the Gen Zs love to be managed through inspiration, millennials love to be coached, Gen X's love cooperation, and the boomers prefer to be it's more about this is the way it's done. So understanding those management styles is how we then open up the communication and also bridge the gap, because people feel, okay, I can see a solution here in themselves. So a keynote needs to inspire, offer solutions so that you can then go on with your program. Okay, so this problem is particularly important in this organization. This myth is something that you've seen over and over again. Let's go down this channel, and here's your presentation, or here's the work that we can do together.
Yeah, awesome. And that's just, you know, illustrates that is a very important strategic approach if you want to be a keynote speaker in corporates and you do run a service-based business. So after going through that process together and getting that clarity and niching into that, and then creating the keynote and then building the strategy after that, how did you find that, and what did that give you as a result?
Confidence. And confidence on a business development call is paramount. So I was having calls with clients and they would say massive statements like, my culture in the organization isn't working. How do I solve it? You know, how do you get your head around that? Whereas now I can have a conversation and go deeper and actually pinpoint what they mean from experience, but also giving them a direction and possible solutions, as opposed to being led by the client who hasn't got the education and hasn't got the background that we have as consultants, because we see the bigger picture. We've done the deep dive work into the industry, so we know what other companies are doing and how to solve it. So for instance, the culture conversation can be a really, really big topic to cover, but you can write a strategic plan in the same way that you do for your marketing or your well-being, and you can break it down and make it all very, very possible. And then you have a different working relationship with the senior management team and a different working relationship with the more junior management team, and then you have another relationship or another program for people that are on the shop front or the customer facing development as well. So that's all slightly different, but you need to start from somewhere. You can't just go in with the top level, how do we change this? And well-being for a long time was a cultural issue, because you had lots of people saying, well, we know we need to do something, but what? So they were coming in from a bottom-up approach. They were saying, okay, we'll give everybody yoga.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But
Sorry, I shouldn't giggle. I love yoga and I love Pilates. But it was like, it was a small plug for a really big issue that they were committed to making a change, but they didn't know how. It wasn't strategic.
Mm-hmm. So this approach absolutely is.
Absolutely.
So as a result of our work together, you have a keynote as well as programs aligned. So tell us a bit about the keynote before we finish. Tell us a bit about the keynote. So if anybody watching this thinks, wow, Adele is speaking right to me, that they can get in touch.
Well, I noticed that this conversation about the differences in the generation was emerging, and I noticed the sort of 5 key issues that were a problem. One of them was the power dynamics. So the millennials felt that they had no agency, they weren't in control of their roles, and you saw that the older generation felt that they had to control their roles. They had to be in place because that was how you nurture respect. So that power dynamic was playing out. Other things like communication styles and communication forums. Different generations want to work in different ways, and having clarity on that can be really, really simple and make big changes. And then another myth that was coming up, which was particularly painful for all sides of the discussion, was the work ethic. So it's the older generation that created this work ethic of workaholic. And because they have that structure in place, or they have that belief in place, they tend to look at the younger generation and say that they're work shy, or that they're not interested in work, when the reality is not really the case. So breaking down those myths and a couple of others helps to bring everything together, helps to bring everything into a conversation, and then we can look at one particular issue and draw upon that. So that's what it gave me, real clarity and a forum in the keynote to explain these issues, but make it a bit of fun, make it a lot of interaction. I think before we worked together, you know, I was doing PowerPoint presentations and I was giving lots of information, whereas now I do less information. And my big, you know, when we say, what's your biggest aha moment at the end of the keynote, you don't say that. I don't say that anymore. I say, what have you learned about yourself today? So it's more about what they've got from the workshop or the keynote, and that is that really does change the conversation.
So the title of your keynote, just to finish?
The generational mindset gap and the diverging views around work ethic.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Adele, for taking the time to share with me your experience and putting that spotlight on the fantastic thing that you have created, the talk that you've created, as well as everything else around the conversations you're having. I'm really excited to see where this all goes.
Well, thank you, Helen. I couldn't have done it without you. Your time and patience and your coaching style really helped to put me out of the stress response and into the higher mind, and to be able to really be creative and think about what I was trying to do strategically, as opposed to firefighting all the time, and be the person that I purport to be, which is like a resilient person that can bounce back. And that was something that I could do because I had the tools.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And well, it's not ending here, because we've got a great connection, and I'll just continue to be excited about what comes next for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen.